How's it going, everybody? This is Matt from Auditor Sense, and on this episode of Audit Trails, we're going to take a look at system boundaries. And this is the first of our three-part series on system boundaries, in which we're going to talk about internal versus external systems. So as we begin to define the perimeter of an information system, the first thing we really have to do is describe the pieces. And this can include things like servers and workstations, firewalls and access points, databases, engineers and technicians, and really so much more depending on what the purpose of your information system is. But one thing starts to become apparent as we define these different components. There are some things we have direct control over, or the system that we're auditing has direct control over, and others that are utilized by the information system but controlled by third parties. Now, obviously, most modern day information systems are connected to the wider network of systems we've come to know as the internet, which allows for comprehensive interactions with third parties. And this is simple in concept and something you probably interact with on a day-to-day basis, but it's important to understand that an information system can encompass these. So when it comes to these third-party systems and classifying something as internal versus external, what it's really going to come down to is control. So an internal system is going to be under complete control of the defining organization. So whether they're adding a system, changing the configuration of an operational one, or removing a component completely, that's all going to be handled under the internal policy, procedures, and processes of the defining organization. On the other hand, external systems are going to be utilized by the defining organization, but some level of control is going to be exercised by a third party. So this could be like hosted infrastructure, performed duties, or some other, blank as a service, database as a service, or application as a service, or platform as a service. Another way to think about this is if the defining organization, the organization defining its boundary, ceased to exist, the external system would not. Only the instance utilized by the organization defining its boundary that no longer exists would. And it's easy to think about this as something like SharePoint or OneDrive. A lot of organizations use these services, but it's, there's components that are controlled by Microsoft. So to kind of dig a little bit deeper into this topic, we're going to take a look over at a sample information system and start to define some of these components. So here we have our sample information system, and it's pretty simple in its application. We have users or clients connecting through a perimeter firewall to our web server. That web server is communicating through an internal firewall to a backend SQL server, maybe storing and accessing user profile information like passwords and email addresses. But whatever that data may be, it's being replicated to a DR storage provider. We have employees accessing organization endpoints, authenticating through Active Directory. And these employees are storing and accessing information on SharePoint and OneDrive. We also have a hosted security service here that's monitoring the information system and different components of the information system for indicators of potential compromise. And then we have this centralized organization component, which we're going to come back to in a second here. So again, when we're thinking about defining the boundary of an information system, and we're specifically trying to decide if a component is internal or external, we want to take a look at who has control. And I think the most intuitive place to start here is probably going to be at this internal network right here. Now we have employees, organization employees accessing organization-owned endpoints, a backend SQL server for our web application, the organization's web application, behind our internal firewall. And it's, kind of black and white here that this would be an internal information system. Everything in here is going to be controlled by our internal policies, procedures, and processes. And then moving out, we have a web server, which is, the crux of our application here, as we can see. That's what our users are accessing. That's what's communicating with this backend server we have here. Maybe these employees here are developers or engineers working on new features and components for our web application or our web service. And if we wanted to remove this web server or make a change to it, that's something that we would have total control over doing. And because of that, that's going to be an internal information system. One step further, we have our perimeter firewall here, where we're going to be defining inbound and outbound traffic flow rules. Deciding how our users are going to be able to connect to our information system. And because we exercise that control and that complete control over this perimeter firewall, that's going to be internal to the information system. Now, as we make our way around here, we can see that our employees are accessing information, storing information on SharePoint and OneDrive. Now, those are our organization employees storing our organization's information. But we know that SharePoint and OneDrive are services of Microsoft. And like we talked about earlier in the PowerPoint slides, if we decide that SharePoint and OneDrive are no longer a service we want to use, maybe they no longer fit our risk profile, we would only be able to remove our instance. SharePoint and OneDrive as a service would still exist, and there's components of that service that we utilize that are controlled by Microsoft. And because we don't have complete control, that's going to be an external information system. Likewise, we have this hosted security service, and that hosted being the key word there. Maybe we have SOC analysts on the other end that are monitoring alerts and alarms. Or maybe it's a totally automated process that's going to deliver alerts to system administrators or security personnel within our organization. But because it's a hosted security service, that's going to be external to the information system as well. And we have our DR storage provider here. And it kind of makes sense from a business continuity and disaster recovery perspective to have our solution in an alternate location. And because this storage provider in this topology is not fully controlled by us, again, it's a provider, that's going to be external to the information system. Now, lastly, we have this centralized organization component, which we're going to kind of use as a talking point throughout this series. Now, the first reaction might be that, well, if it's part of the organization, that this information system is utilized by, that must be internal to the information system. But it's not always that simple. Maybe this organization won a contract with a federal agency to host an application for them. And if that was the case, then this information system for this application we need to go through something called an ATO, or an authority to operate, in which it's going to have to define its own authorization boundaries, something we're going to talk about in our second installment of the security boundary series. And because it's going to need to define that boundary that's specific to this one application, it would need to be considered its own information system, or an information system in its own right. Maybe there's no federal entities involved at all. It's all part of the same organization. But this centralized organization component is a moderate risk security categorization, whereas this specific application or component is high risk, maybe because of the information that our employees are working with, or the information that it processes. Maybe it's very important to our organization. And because of that, we want to define it within its own boundaries, within its own information system, so we can more properly address that security risk. Or maybe even it's just the standard that we're using. Maybe this web server is processing payment card information, so PCI DSS comes into play, whereas the central organization doesn't normally deal with that sort of thing. So because of that, maybe it's just going to, again, be defined as its own information system. And really the key here is we don't want to make our information system boundary too big, because then we're incorporating unnecessary risk that might be outside the control of our system owners. And we also don't want to make it too small, because then we could potentially be excluding components from the protection requirements of our organization or the security requirements of a compliance standard that we're trying to meet. So what this really comes down to is, for something like this, we need to have a comprehensive conversation with stakeholders to see how we want to define this. And there's not really one catch-all right answer. It's going to have to be a back and forth to come to an understanding of an acceptable level of risk. So for this series, and for moving forward, again, for this kind of talking point, we're going to mark this centralized organization component as external to this information system for this web server, web application that we're using. So again, just to kind of wrap things up, when we're talking about internal or external systems, it really comes down to who has control. And if we have total control over something, it's an internal system. But if there is some power exercised by a third party, that's going to be external to the information system. And this isn't necessarily a complex topic, but it does play directly into understanding what responsibilities we as auditors expect to be met by system owners. So in the following episodes, we're going to kind of see more of how those expectations play into an assessment, and how auditing internal systems will differ from auditing external ones, and how certain external systems can be more heavily incorporated into our review process depending on the data that they interact with. But for the time being, we're going to wrap it up there. I encourage you guys to leave any comments or questions you may have, and look forward to seeing you in the next installment of our Security Boundary series. Thank you.